It's very difficult to understand something that we've never experienced or observed before. When we discover information or concepts that stand outside the systems we use to evaluate all things prior to that discovery, we often ask the same questions that we would about things inside of those systems, with the belief that the same problems apply. When Wilbur and Orville Wright pioneered human flight, they fundamentally and permanently changed the assumptions that human beings have about transportation. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have their share of skeptics asking why their planes didn't fall out of the sky like every attempt before. Criticisms of Bitcoin are often rooted in the belief that the problems that all monies and assets have had before apply to it as well, even though solving those problems is the fundamental purpose of the technology. Throughout history, problems originating from governments have plagued the mechanisms by which we exchange goods, energy, and labor. Governments, although they undoubtedly serve a purpose, have strong tendencies towards the manipulation of capital markets, the production of debt, and the confiscation of assets. Until now, they have been able to do so with impunity, as they have a monopoly on both force and the control of money. Naturally, it's difficult to understand what makes Bitcoin different. Why isn't it subject to these same problems? The problems of seizure, of forfeiture, of repricing, and of banning. That's what we'll be discussing today. I am Yevgeny Nurish, and this is Critique 3, Disruption by Governments. After learning the fundamentals of Bitcoin, one of the most frequently asked questions by healthy skeptics is, okay, let's assume Bitcoin does in fact have all of these unique and powerful properties. What does that matter if the government bans Bitcoin or interferes with it somehow? This is an excellent question, and one that doesn't have a single simple answer. After all, Bitcoin is potentially an existential threat to fiat currencies over a long enough time frame, and anything that threatens the monopolistic control of the production of debt and money by governments is sure to be noticed and addressed by those governments in some capacity at some point. Luckily for us, Bitcoin is extremely difficult to disrupt by design, for reasons we'll be discussing shortly. It's best to frame this discussion with consideration to a few factors. 1. How is Bitcoin resistant to government influence? There are some historical and technical realities about Bitcoin that you should understand before we get too in the weeds about political realities. Most people know that Bitcoin was originally proposed by the pseudonymous Satoshi Nakamoto, but many fewer people know that he was inspired by and collaborated with a group of fellow cryptographers and computer scientists who called themselves cypherpunks. There are excellent histories of the cypherpunk movement, so I won't go into great detail. But the movement itself is foundationally rooted in the protection of the sovereignty, privacy, and identity of the individual from hostile actors, especially governments, through the creation of open source code. In other words, resistance to arbitrary authority was woven into the ideological fabric of Bitcoin from the very beginning. Resistance to authority is useful as an idea, but how does this idea manifest in Bitcoin in a practical sense? For one, Bitcoin's code cannot be altered by any individual, and the computational energy that is used to secure and validate the Bitcoin network is distributed globally. While in its infancy, Bitcoin could theoretically have been vulnerable to attack due to having very few users and nodes, destroying, altering, or even slowing down Bitcoin today would require a coordinated attack by hundreds of countries on every single Bitcoin node and miner in the world. If this weren't already infeasible enough, most Bitcoin nodes utilize network anonymizing technologies like Tor that make locating them prohibitively difficult. And on top of that, any personal computer with 7 or so gigabytes of free disk space can run a node. Put bluntly, in order to destroy Bitcoin today, every nation-state in the world would have to effectively ban personal computing, at which point we have much more dire concerns than what money we use. Furthermore, because Bitcoin is fully peer-to-peer, governments have no ability to stop people from transacting with each other, making bans unenforceable. There is no intermediary for governments to influence, to intercept, or impede payments. Because it doesn't exist in physical space or a fixed location, it can't be seized or confiscated like gold was in 1933. And in the event that the jurisdiction you live in becomes unfriendly to Bitcoin, if you can memorize 12 words, you can carry your Bitcoin with you at all times and bring it anywhere in the world, the import of which will become clear shortly. 2. Why wouldn't a government want to ban Bitcoin? Despite being unable to enforce an outright ban on Bitcoin, it's fairly obvious why a government would at least be wary of it or attempt to prevent its citizens from obtaining and holding it. For what reasons would a government be friendly to Bitcoin? The most obvious is the classic adage, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. Since it isn't possible or practical to prevent people from transacting with Bitcoin peer-to-peer, it behooves governments to figure out a way to support it, or even hold it on their balance sheets. If a government provides regulatory clarity for Bitcoin and makes it easy for exchanges and banks to buy and sell Bitcoin in their jurisdiction, it's potentially a massive source of tax revenue. While they would have difficulty finding and taxing private peer-to-peer transactions, a majority of Bitcoin trading volume today comes from exchanges, who, in turn, are required to obtain knowledge about their users, called KYC, or Know Your Customer. In 2022, the Bitcoin network settled $14 trillion in total transaction volume. Even with a tiny 2% tax on that volume, that's $280 billion in tax revenue. And that number will only continue to grow larger year after year as the market capitalization and adoption of Bitcoin increase, meaning that while at a surface level analysis, governments seem incentivized to attack Bitcoin, the governments that house the exchanges where most of the trading volume occurs will have a colossal advantage over the ones that don't. This brings us to the game theory element of Bitcoin as it pertains to governments. If you're unfamiliar, game theory is the study of mathematical models of strategic interactions among rational agents, in this case, world governments. Money is a zero-sum game, meaning simply that when it comes to the acquisition of resources, which are finite, there will always be winners and losers, those with more, those with less, and those with nothing, who will be wiped out and forgotten. Countries already fight very hard to attract wealthy, influential individuals through things like tax codes. Puerto Rico, for instance, is the only place on Earth where you can be a U.S. citizen and pay no income or capital gains tax. They do this to attract wealthy business people to Puerto Rico, with the intention of those people building strong businesses there and strengthening the Puerto Rican economy. Much like companies offer different products to attract different consumers, countries offer different legal features and benefits to attract different types of commerce. This is why Switzerland is famous for its banking system, why Singapore is one of the fastest growing technology hubs in the world, and why Dubai houses some of the wealthiest people ever to live. They provide incentives that attract people to them. While I discuss Bitcoin mining's unique properties in the support and development of sustainable energy grids in my essay Critique 2, The Cost of Energy, this is another compelling reason for governments to adopt it. Today, the friendliest jurisdiction to Bitcoin in the world is El Salvador, an example of a country that maximally utilizes both of the aforementioned use cases of Bitcoin for governments. In El Salvador, Bitcoin is legal tender, and El Salvadoran residency and path to citizenship can be purchased for 3 Bitcoins. El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, is paving the way to make El Salvador the Bitcoin capital of the world, and in fact just passed a bill that will establish Bitcoin-backed volcano bonds to finance Bitcoin mining operations, 100% powered by renewables, primarily energy from El Salvador's many active volcanoes. It's clear that Bitcoin is here to stay. It's been around for 14 years now, and it continues to win and grow year after year as its thesis becomes stronger and more obvious. Let's make the very reasonable assumption that demand for Bitcoin will continue to grow, while demand for other assets like gold and government debt continue to shrink. As Bitcoin demonetizes those other assets and absorbs their market capitalization, the countries that are friendliest to Bitcoin, that is, the ones that legislatively support Bitcoin users, Bitcoin businesses, and Bitcoin innovation, will quickly become the wealthiest countries in the world. This brings us to 3. What can governments do to stop or impede the progress of Bitcoin? And how likely and effective are each of these methods? We've established that the outright ban or destruction of Bitcoin is virtually impossible, and that there are strong economic incentives against attempting to do so. However, it would be intellectually dishonest to say that there aren't other methods by which governments could impede the progress of Bitcoin, each with varying degrees of probability and efficacy. Luckily for us, we don't have to baselessly speculate on what types of bans or restrictions could be attempted or what their effects are. Bitcoin is already explicitly banned in 9 countries, most notably China. It's also implicitly banned or faces heavy restrictions in 42 other countries. It's important to note that in all of these cases, the bans are on all cryptocurrencies and digital assets, not just Bitcoin. Let's take a look at why the bans occurred and try to measure their efficacy. In the case of China, surprisingly, was actually one of the first countries to embrace Bitcoin. The first major exchanges were established in China as early as 2011, and Bitcoin was used for payments in Chinese businesses as early as 2013. For several years, a majority of all Bitcoin mining globally was even housed in China due to the low cost of electricity. However, in June of 2021, the Chinese government suddenly changed their tune. the People's Bank of China explicitly banned the sale, purchase, and mining of all cryptocurrency. Their stated reason for doing so was to, quote, prevent money laundering, illegal fundraising, fraud, pyramid schemes, and other illegal and criminal activities, end quote. However, let's read between the lines and make some educated guesses as to the real reason for this ban, as the Chinese government has a less than stellar track record when it comes to honesty. As discussed in The Necessity of Neutral Money, China has among the most oppressive monetary policies in the world, with a complete stranglehold on the finances of Chinese citizens. This makes their economy selectively insular, with all import and export of goods strictly monitored and controlled by the CCP. The greatest fear of the Chinese government, and the thing that it goes to great lengths to prevent, is the same thing I mentioned earlier in regards to game theory: capital flight from China to other jurisdictions. Bitcoin is unseizable property you can carry with you anywhere in the world, and China's number one priority is to contain even its wealthiest citizens within the borders of the country. One has to look no further than the story of Jack Ma and the Ant Group for a perfect illustration of this policy. In 2020, Jack Ma was the richest man in China and the founder of Alibaba, one of the largest consumer and wholesale marketplaces in the entire world. His company, Ant Group, was set to release a payment system product that sought to compete with and disrupt China's banks. And Ma made a public statement that was critical of China's financial system, not dissimilar from, and certainly no harsher than the ones that I am making right now. Within a week, he was summoned to meet with regulators. Ant Group's product launch was halted, and the company lost $76 billion in valuation overnight. Ma, formerly a very public and outspoken figurehead for the Chinese corporate world, was not seen in public for almost 3 months afterwards. It is widely believed he was incarcerated during this time. Additionally, China has recently released its own native central bank digital currency, or CBDC, the digital yuan. The last thing they want is for the monetary energy from a CBDC that they can use to puppeteer their citizens to flow into a digital asset that cuts the marionette strings. I say all of this to illustrate the degree of direct control and influence China possesses and exercises over its own economy before we discuss how effective the Bitcoin ban was. While China's crypto mining ban was very effective in the immediate short term, with Chinese hash rate, that is, their contribution to the power of the Bitcoin network, dropping to 0% of global contribution within a month of the ban, many of those miners simply moved to neighboring Kazakhstan, providing the economic benefit of their business to that country. Today, despite the ban, clandestine Chinese underground mining operations have bounced back and produce over 20% of global hash rate. In the 12 months following the ban, Chinese citizens still conducted roughly $220 billion worth of Bitcoin transfers on exchanges by using VPNs or other workarounds to protect their privacy and preserve their financial freedom, meaning that even in the face of the strongest regulation imaginable in the most hostile jurisdiction, Bitcoin still survives and even thrives. We saw a similar pattern emerge with Nigeria in the same year. Similar to China, Nigeria declared that the use of cryptocurrency is a quote, direct contravention of existing law, unquote, and banned commercial banks from dealing in them beginning in February 2021. Like China, it warned that cryptocurrency trading poses risks including investment loss, money laundering, and terrorism financing. But, again, the real reason was that Nigeria was afraid of the loss of control and faith in its currency, the naira, which currently inflates at a rate of just over 21% per year. And just like China, all that Nigeria accomplished was creating a massive demand for Bitcoin in secondary markets, primarily peer-to-peer exchanges this time. In fact, I can anecdotally attest to this boom in demand. At the time of the ban, a close friend of mine was working on the development of special economic zones in Nigeria, and he put me into contact with several Nigerians who wanted to purchase Bitcoin from me directly, in many cases with 7 to 10% markup from the market rate. These secondary markets are what ensure that Bitcoin survives virtually any scenario. As long as there are people who believe in the value of freedom, Bitcoiners will find ways to transact with each other, no matter what barriers are put in place by those hostile to it. Other types of impediments have been implemented. The firewalling of cryptocurrency exchanges, the prohibitions of commercial banks or financial services participating in cryptocurrency transactions, limitations on the energy consumption of miners, or even the forced sale of mined crypto to central banks, as in Iran. All of these had little to no success in halting or even slowing the inevitable progress of Bitcoin. However, despite these examples of attempts to disrupt the network, I will be the first to admit that if the U.S. were to take similar actions, the outcome would be more noticeable than the policy decisions of Nigeria, China, or any of the other countries who have tried and failed to hamstring Bitcoin. While ultimately a U.S. ban would just drive Bitcoiners to other jurisdictions, that isn't an option for everyone, and the world tends to look to the U.S. in matters of financial regulation and policy for novel assets. The global economy, after all, is not denominated in the digital yuan or the naira. It's denominated in U.S. dollars, and that means that if the U.S. were to institute similar bans, while it certainly would not kill Bitcoin, it would have a major impact on adoption and price in the near term. Fortunately for us, the U.S. government, for all its faults and failings, is not ultimately a stupid organization. They understand very well the game theory implications and long-term potential impact of a global monetary network that they don't control, as well as the benefit of holding Bitcoin on the balance sheet and attracting Bitcoiners to the United States. This brings us to our fourth and final point, the current position of the U.S. government on Bitcoin. The White House, Congress, and various financial regulatory bodies of the U.S., most notably the Securities and Exchange Commission, or SEC, and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission, CFTC, are those whose opinions matter most on how Bitcoin is ultimately recognized and treated as an asset class. While all have different opinions, which I'll break down in brief, they have a few things in common. While cryptocurrency at large as an asset class has been the subject of significant criticism, a majority of legislators and regulators seem to be in agreement that the innovation of Bitcoin is real, and have in fact made it clear that there is no intention to ban it in any capacity. Most policymakers also agree that the lack of regulatory clarity in regards to crypto assets is a problem that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later. How those assets should be classified, the regulations surrounding them, and where the responsibility of the enforcement of that regulation falls is where things get hazy. Thankfully, our focus is on Bitcoin, not crypto writ large. While an overwhelming majority of crypto tokens and assets fall under the umbrella of a security, Bitcoin is universally and unambiguously considered a commodity by U.S. regulators. The CFTC clearly states that Bitcoin is considered a commodity under the Commodities Exchange Act. And SEC Chairman Gary Gensler, whose position we will discuss in greater detail shortly, has explicitly stated in interviews that Bitcoin is the only crypto asset that he considers a commodity rather than a security. This distinction is very important because the designation of an asset as a security comes with complex regulatory challenges, including the requirement of registration. In short, a token like Ethereum or Ripple is much more like a share of stock in a company than a commodity like gold or silver. Securities require both public disclosures about the nature of the security and an enormous amount of legal and financial resources to achieve and maintain compliance with securities law, and they are much more strictly regulated than commodities. Because Bitcoin is a commodity, or an asset without an issuer, there is no requirement of registration, and it is treated legally much more like property. It's worth noting that a majority of crypto tokens are currently non-compliant with the SEC, who have in turn begun to take serious regulatory action on those tokens, from heavy fines to outright dissolution. I'll break down in brief the current positions of the three parties that will likely shape the future of the regulatory framework for U.S. adoption of Bitcoin. The most important individual in shaping and enforcing Bitcoin policy in the U.S. is very likely the aforementioned Gary Gensler, the chairman of the SEC. Chair Gensler appears to be very knowledgeable about the function and mechanisms inherent to blockchains and crypto assets. While Gensler has been notoriously critical of the crypto space as a whole, and has stated quite clearly that regulatory crackdowns are approaching very quickly for non-compliant actors in the industry, he said the following about Bitcoin in his 2021 address to the Aspen Security Forum, an address I would recommend reading if you have any questions about the position of perhaps the most well-educated individual who has a direct influence on the enforcement of policy. Quote, "Before starting at the SEC, I had the honor of researching, writing, and teaching about the intersection of finance and technology at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This included courses on crypto finance, blockchain technology, and money. In that work, I came to believe that, though there was a lot of hype masquerading as reality in the crypto field, Nakamoto's innovation is real. Further, it has been and could continue to be a catalyst for change in the fields of finance and money." End quote. It's clear from that quote and the rest of the address that Gensler is actually friendly towards and even optimistic about the potential impact of Bitcoin on the future of finance. That said, Gensler is ultimately an enforcer, not a policymaker. It's much more difficult to pin down the general outlook of Congress on Bitcoin since it's composed of over 500 individuals rather than a single person. While I'm not a DC insider, it appears to me that many Congresspeople are decidedly neutral on Bitcoin. Typically, when Bitcoin-related issues are brought to the floor of these legislative bodies, Congresspeople ask questions that very clearly indicate a complete fundamental lack of knowledge of Bitcoin. This is very likely due to a lack of understanding of the importance of Bitcoin and its relegation to low priority status in the minds of most legislators, at least today. However, given the recent scandals in the cryptocurrency industry, the collapse of Terra Luna, Celsius, Voyager, Three Arrows Capital, and most recently and famously, FTX, I suspect that will change. While none of these scandals had anything to do with Bitcoin, and in fact, Bitcoin escaped for the most part reputationally unscathed, and with its price already recovered to pre-FTX levels, Bitcoin's association with the cryptocurrency industry will force legislators to have an opinion, one way or another. The good news for us is that for those representatives and senators not currently neutral or uninformed, we have some surprisingly well-educated and outspoken advocates for Bitcoin in Congress, some of whom have already drafted pro-Bitcoin legislation that supports the privacy and sovereignty of Bitcoiners and provides regulatory clarity and support for Bitcoin businesses, including miners. Senators Cynthia Loomis of Wyoming and Pat Toomey of Pennsylvania, and Representatives Tom Emmer and Warren Davidson of Minnesota and Ohio, respectively, are the most vocal advocates. But there are dozens more who have expressed their appreciation of Bitcoin as a tool that restores power and financial freedom to the hands of citizens. Conversely, the loudest anti-crypto legislator by far is Senator Elizabeth Warren of Massachusetts. She uses precisely the same rhetoric as China and other nations who have attempted to suppress Bitcoin, rather tellingly, asserting that Bitcoin is used to finance illicit activities, financial crimes, and terrorism. Her recently proposed bill, the Digital Asset Anti-Money Laundering Act, would require the submission of detailed personal information for even private Bitcoin transactions, a bill that is simultaneously impossible to enforce and alienates the fastest-growing segment of financial innovation of the last 50 years. Thankfully, Warren is not taken very seriously by the general public or her peers in D.C., and wields very little influence in the Senate as a member of the relatively tiny Progressive Democratic caucus. If she is Bitcoin's biggest roadblock in the legislative branch, even as an adversarial thinker, I would consider her a non-threat. Worth noting is that just last week, Congress created a special digital assets subcommittee and appointed Representative French Hill of Arkansas as its head. While the subcommittee has not yet announced any prospective legislation, their stated goal is to, quote, provide clear rules of the road among federal regulators for the digital asset ecosystem, developing policies that promote financial technology to reach underserved communities, and identifying best practices and policies that continue to strengthen diversity and inclusion in the digital asset ecosystem, end quote. While I put very little faith in the word of politicians, it sounds like the Digital Assets Subcommittee will at the very least be working towards a world where institutional adoption of Bitcoin is encouraged with the approval of government, which is a net positive for Bitcoin. This leaves the last major player in decisions regarding Bitcoin, the president. The White House released their comprehensive framework for responsible development of digital assets on September 16, 2022, after an executive order was issued by President Biden to research the scope, risks, and applications of cryptocurrency. The public memo itself is only about 7 pages long, and worth the read, but the major talking points are as follows. In the pro-Bitcoin column, the memo outlines the need for consumer protections in the digital asset space, and references some of the crypto lender and exchange collapses that occurred last year. It also recognizes the reality of 7 million unbanked Americans, and the need to provide financial services to them, along with the announcement of the FedNow program, an interbank clearing system that will utilize digital assets. It goes on to describe a desire to advance responsible innovation in the digital assets sector, including integration with existing financial systems. In what I would consider the anti-Bitcoin column, the memo mentions monitoring the energy usage of crypto asset networks, citing a need for environmental justice, whatever that means. There is also mention of proposing anti-money laundering measures, including penalties for unlicensed money transmitting, although it is not clear what the thresholds are. The worst news is, as I mentioned in the necessity of neutral money, the proposition of a United States dollar central bank digital currency. While the memo makes very clear that the White House is still in the fact-finding and risk assessment stage of development, with no clear path towards the actual development of a CBDC, this is something we must avoid and protest at all costs. CBDCs spell the end of financial privacy. All transactions and consumer behavior will be monitored, and over the long term, the government will be unable to resist the temptation to meddle with markets in much the same way China has with the digital yuan. All in all, we see that, while not everything is sunshine and roses, the political outlook for Bitcoin is actually much brighter than one may expect for a technology that so explicitly seeks to diminish the power central banks and governments wield. We've seen that even if the governments of the world united against Bitcoin, it's built to survive all but complete coordinated assault on the network by every nation-state on the planet. We've seen that there are a multitude of reasons for governments to embrace Bitcoin, utilizing it as a source of tax revenue and a way to attract entrepreneurship and the development of more robust energy grids. We've seen that even in regions where Bitcoin is banned or actively attacked by governments who tend towards financial totalitarianism, demand for Bitcoin grows rather than shrinks, much like grasses and roots emerging through cracks in a sidewalk. And finally, while we see that the US still has much to do in regards to clarifying the place of Bitcoin in our economy, all signs point towards a future friendly to Bitcoin and Bitcoiners, where institutions have clear guidelines and incentives towards the acquisition of Bitcoin, and one where regulatory crackdown for the crypto tokens that seek to ride the coattails of Bitcoin's innovation is very likely right around the corner. Ultimately, Bitcoin does not care whether or not any given government, regulator, or organization is friendly or hostile to it. It has and will continue to function regardless of roadblocks put in its way. And while governments can play a useful role in the speed at which Bitcoin adoption occurs, it doesn't need their help. I don't write these essays in the hopes that politicians and regulators notice. I write them for people like you and I, who just want to reclaim our independence and reduce, if not eliminate, the ability of any political body or central banker to make our decisions for us. The political class is a tiny minority of the global population. Conversely, there are over 100 million people today who use Bitcoin as a tool for freedom and defense from those that would try to govern, confiscate, or inflate away our wealth. And that number is only going up. Do the math. Thanks for listening.
You're scared of a world where you're needed, so you never made nice with the locals, but you tied me up slow with your vine.